Let's get those titles up here so that you know where you're at. We are here in the reading room, not the critical thinking room, not the spiritual classroom, but the reading room. Oh, I don't have that in yellow. I need to get that in yellow. And we are finishing up our story by James Buckley Jr., who was Booker T. Washington. Let's get this story finished. So, kind of a controversial figure, right? Really advanced some of the topics that black people wanted advanced to talk about in the news, right? But the person who benefited, it seems, was Booker T. Washington and not the African people, right? Not African Americans here in this country. Chapter 8. Should put it on this side, shouldn't I? Chapter 8, Finishing the Work. In 1905, President Roosevelt visited Booker at Tuskegee Institute. Together they watched the parade of floats and wagons that had been decorated by the students. A bed of flowers spelled out the president's name. Both men gave speeches praising the other. Roosevelt's visit brought national attention to the school at a time when Booker was being criticized by other black leaders for thinking that slow but steady equality was a good plan. He's got the president's attention, so that's probably pretty good, right? The very next year, rumors spread in Atlanta that some black men had attacked a group of white women. Whether this was true or not, a white mob formed. They wanted to get revenge. In September 1906, they attacked black people in the streets. The mob rampaged for days until enough police arrived to stop them. Why did it take so long? As many as 30 black people had been killed in the fighting. Black leaders spoke out loudly against the riots. Booker asked people to be careful. He wanted black people to remain calm, but the Atlanta incident wasn't the only case of black outrage. Earlier in the summer, most U.S. Army soldiers in Brownsville, Texas, were charged with taking part in a murder. All of the accused soldiers were black. The case was never proven, but the people of Texas demanded action. And since the soldiers were U.S. troops, the decision was up to President Roosevelt. In October of 1906, Booker visited the president to urge him to help calm things down. Instead, Roosevelt told Booker he wanted to fire all the black soldiers who had been accused of the Texas murder. Booker was shocked and hurt by Roosevelt's decision. When President William Taft won the next decision in early November, he fired the soldiers, but it was Theodore Roosevelt who took the blame among black people. And since Booker had a close relationship with Roosevelt, he was blamed too. It was becoming harder and harder for people to listen to Booker's ideas about slow and steady change. The outcry for equality was growing. In 1909, Du Bois, with help from both black and white supporters, founded the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. The group soon became the national voice for black Americans, much as Booker had been for many years. We don't hear a lot about it. We do, but we don't, right? The NAACP. Lots of negative stuff, but not a lot of positive things. After founding the National Negro Business League, Booker's health continued to worsen. Chapter 9, A Legacy of Learning. During a trip to New York in 1915, he became very sick. Doctors there told him that he might not have much more time to live. Booker's wife, Margaret, traveled from Alabama to take him home. On November 14, 1915, Booker T. Washington died from kidney failure in his bed at Tuskegee Institute, the place he loved best. Millions of people, both black and white, mourned his death. He was praised around the country for the many great things he had done for African Americans. After Booker's death, Robert Morton took over as leader of Tuskegee for the next 20 years. Dr. Morton was succeeded in 1935 by Dr. Frederick D. Patterson. It was Dr. Patterson who brought the Tuskegee Airmen Flight Training Program to the Institute. The school Booker had founded grew steadily and remains an important center of learning for African Americans. Over the years, Tuskegee moved away from Booker's focus on developing technical and farming skills toward more traditional college classes. It became a full university in 1985. Today it has more than 3,100 students and has produced thousands of black scientists, educators, engineers, and military officers. Yeah, what happened to the Tuskegee Institute, Tuskegee experiment on those men? The Tuskegee Airmen were the first African American military pilots in the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II, 1939 to 1945. Many U.S. states and the American military were still racially segregated. All of the black fighters and bomber pilots who trained in the United States trained at Morton Field, the Tuskegee Army Airfield, and were educated at Tuskegee University. Officially, the Tuskegee Airmen made up the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bombardment Group of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Perhaps Booker's longest-lasting legacy is in schools like Tuskegee University. There are now more than 100 colleges and universities that have been established to help African American students. Among the most important are Howard University. Howard University is the one that doesn't take any federal funding. Spelman College, Morehouse College, Grambling University. Spelman College, I worked at, Spelman College has to be Paul Spellman's doing, which I worked at an engineering company with Paul Spellman. I would bet he's Spelman College, I would bet. These are colleges do not take federal funding either, so there's probably more colleges, but only one university that doesn't, Howard. The school Booker attended under the guidance of General Armstrong is now called Hampton University. The largest such school is Florida A&M University with nearly 10,000 students. The monument to Booker T. Washington at Hampton University. During the years after Booker's death, dozens of laws continued to keep blacks and whites separate in American South. These laws, called Jim Crow laws, had started in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They continued to create separate schools, swimming pools, drinking fountains, trains, restaurants, and more. In the North and West, segregation was not the law, but black citizens still struggled with widespread racism in many forms. In the years after World War II, a growing civil rights movement began in the South and spread around the country. Booker's way of thinking was no longer embraced by African Americans. When he wrote, "The race cannot expect to get everything at once. It must learn to wait and bide its time," Booker could probably not imagine that movements in the 1950s and 60s could not imagine the movements of the 1950s and 60s. Modern civil rights protesters called for fast change, new laws, and equal rights. Booker T. Washington was born a slave and became the leading voice of former slaves and their descendants. He was a black American leader who believed in education and business opportunities for all African Americans. He worked constantly to change the lives of people like himself, people who came up from slavery looking for a better life. The timeline of Booker T. Washington's life. Booker T. Washington was born a slave, known simply as Booker, without a last name, on a plantation in Hales Ford, Virginia in 1856. In 1865, he was freed along with other slaves after the Civil War ended, and then he moved to Malden, West Virginia. In 1872, he arrived at Hampton Institute and graduated in 1875. In 1879, he returns to Hampton Institute as a teacher. In 1881, he opens Tuskegee Normal School in Tuskegee, Alabama. You need to look up the Tuskegee experiment. We've talked about it. Marries Fannie Norton Smith in 1882. His daughter Portia is born in 1883. After the death of Fanny a year earlier, he marries Olivia Davidson. In 1887, son Booker T. Jr. is born, and then his son Ernest is born, and his wife Olivia dies. He marries Margaret Murray in 1892, so that's his third wife. Delivers important speech at Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta in 1895 and 1896. He receives honorary degree from Harvard University. In 1899, he travels with Margaret to Europe. In 1900, he founds the National Negro Business League. In 1901, he publishes his autobiography, Up from Slavery, and dines at the White House with President Theodore Roosevelt. In 1915, he dies at Tuskegee Institute at the age of 59. That's pretty young. Timeline of the world. 1848, the California Gold Rush begins. In 1852, Napoleon III declared Emperor of France. In 1861, the American Civil War begins and ends in 1865. In 1871, Bavaria and Prussia unify to create modern Germany. That's very interesting. I did not know that. Prussia was part of Russia, and Bavaria created in 1871 modern Germany. 1872, the U.S. Congress names Yellowstone the world's first national park. In 1880, Thomas Alva Edison patents the first working light bulb. In 1887, a flood on the Yellow River in China kills 900,000 people. Dear Jesus, oh my goodness gracious, what a historic event. Unbelievable. 1893, New Zealand becomes the first country to give women the vote in national elections. You go, New Zealand! The first modern Olympic Games are held in Athens in 1896. I didn't realize they were so late. Guglielmo Marconi sends the first radio signals across the Atlantic Ocean. The Wright brothers in 1903 fly the first airplane. In 1907, an earthquake in Kingston, Jamaica kills 1,000 people. I remember hearing about that when I was in Jamaica. I was there in Kingston. William Howard Taft in 1910 is the first U.S. president to throw out the first ball at a baseball game on April 15th. World War I begins in 1914. Pluto is photographed for the first time on March 19th, 1915. Pluto, the planet. Not Pluto the dog, Disney. And there are the bibliographies. So if you want to know, this is good. The Awakening of the Negro from the Atlantic in September 1896. I want to read that. I have an Atlantic Monthly article that I brought for this topic as well. There is the bibliography if you're interested, and some, what are those websites there? So a website and who, what, where. So there's a Booker T. Washington speech there too. Tomorrow we'll start a new book. I don't know what it's going to be yet. Any suggestions? Below. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. Thank you so much for joining me here in the reading room. And we have just finished the book from the New York Times best-selling series, Who Was Booker T. Washington? Thanks for joining me. Dr. Annette Feravich. I'm the teacher here in the classroom.